So Jason asked me a couple weeks ago, actually like 2 months ago, if I'd be willing to preach sometime. And of course I said yes. And so he gave me the nice schedule of all through James, what we're looking at. And I knew I was going down to the Dominican, so I chose based on dates which one I would do. And well, I chose one of the most brutal passages probably in the New Testament, so that was fun. It's, yeah. It's been a real treat preparing for this, but I definitely find how thankful I am for people like Jason who do this week in and week out. I certainly couldn't. I mean, of course, by the grace of God, I could, but it's something totally different, and I appreciate the fact that you do this every week. I really do. So the passages we're looking at today are James 4:13 through 5:6. We've all been there before, where we make plans in life for our future, whatever it may be. But how often do we do that without actually acknowledging God or approaching Him in those plans? Let me show you a time in my life where I made major life plans without even considering God once. When I graduated from high school, I decided I really wanted to go and get a degree in computer science and programming. One, I love computer stuff. Two, I wanted the money. It's supposed to pay wealth, it's supposed to be really good, and I wanted that. So that's exactly what I did. I decided to pursue the career in computer programming, and my first semester went really well. I loved it, loved all my classes, and then started the next semester, and actually went really well starting out. Started my actual programming classes, really loved them. And I thought I was doing well, and I thought I was well on my way to a nice career. However, some things that I could not have foreseen happened in my life, and I ended up dropping out completely. Suddenly I found myself kind of in a bad spot. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know what career, what my life held in front of me. And so I was stressed, and I was desperate for some direction. Years later, I would realize that my big flaw in all of this was that I wanted to do it my way, and I had no interest at the time in even asking God, what do you have for my life? If only I had read the book of James at that point before I tried to decide my future. Perhaps I would have spared myself a lot of headache and heartache and stress. So why would James have helped? Well, as we already know, he's just blunt and honest and gets right to the point. So there are two things that I want us to see in these passages today. I want to see that we must not forget God in anything, and we must be generous and loving to others. As we know, James was the brother of Jesus, and the letter was written to early Christians that were struggling to maintain their faith and live holy lives before the Lord. As you can imagine, early Christians struggled with a lot of the same things that we still do today, which is great for us that James wrote this because it still applies today. There's a particular passage in James that is useful in reminding us that we should never, ever forget God, and that is James 4:13 through 5 through 6, the ones we're looking at today. But let's start with 4:13 through 17. It says this: "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make profit. Yet do you not know what tomorrow brings? What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance, and also all such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is a sin." At a first glance, it may seem that James is saying we should not make plans for our lives. This is not at all what he's saying. I mean, how could it be? We all have a common tendency to make plans and set goals for our lives. And we actually kind of need to make plans for our life, just daily even. I would imagine most of y'all planned to come this morning to church. Of course, James is not saying planning or making goals is bad. But he wants us to see that there's a difference between how we typically plan and how we should make plans. Let's look back at verse 17. "So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is a sin." What sin is James actually talking about here? The sin here is something that's very wicked, is terrible, and honestly, we all do it every day at some point. The sin is forgetting God. We are warned that to go about our lives and forget God is one of the most dangerous sins of all. The late Pastor Timothy Keller, one of Jason's favorites, defined this particular sin as this. He said, living or planning or working or operating without continual and relentless reference to God mentally and emotionally. That's what that sin is. To do that without any regard for what God has for your life. There's a reason we are told multiple times throughout Scripture to pray without ceasing. For example, 1 Thessalonians 5:17, pray without ceasing. Ephesians 6:18, praying all the time in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. Romans 12:12 says, rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, and be constant in prayer. Colossians 4:2, continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in with thanksgiving. Philippians 4:6, do not be anxious about anything, but everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And Luke 18, and he told them a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. These are just a handful that I randomly picked out talking about how we're supposed to pray continuously, but Scripture is just full of this. To simply say that we will do this or that in our life is no good for us. We must truly say, God willing. This is not just some words we must add, like just a little tagline that we put on, but we need to truly mean it. Like, we need to truly seek the Lord, not just add it because we think we're supposed to add these words at the end of whatever we're saying. Perhaps you were wondering, like I was at the time, way back then, why is this sin so bad for us? Why is it really that bad to forget God and just even the minute things? And if so, if it is so bad, how can we avoid this sin? Let me answer the first question. Why is the sin so bad for us and for God? Well, how many of y'all like to be forgotten? I would imagine nobody does. It's not fun. How many of us have not been invited with friends before? Like, we missed an invite we would have loved to have gone to. Have you ever been with people who received a gift for Christmas or whatever from family members and you didn't get anything? I mean, that kind of stinks. One of the absolute worst feelings in this life is to have been forgotten, especially by somebody we love very much. And that's how God feels. This is why forgetting God is so awful a sin, especially because he loves us so much. How many times have we only thought of him on Sunday, or perhaps maybe 15 minutes in the morning if we're doing a Bible study, or devotions or whatever? Just so small part of our life that we even consider God. Part of Psalm 9 comes to mind, and it says this: all those who are wicked and forget God will be sent to the grave. And that's pretty gut-wrenching, to forget God and you'll be sent to the grave. Knowing that it is wicked to forget God is scary, because we've all done it. We'll probably continue to do it, hopefully less and less, but we'll even probably do it today. The good thing is, the next part in Psalm 9, it says, but those who are afflicted and remember God will not be forgotten. So we have an option. We can either forget him or remember him. And if we remember him, he will also remember us. How incredible is that? We have a tendency to remember the things that are important to us. It actually comes easy to remember those things. Have you ever been to a wedding where you're standing there and down comes the aisle, the bride, and she forgot her makeup, her dress, whatever? I don't think any of y'all have been to that kind of wedding, because I certainly haven't. Because those things are important to her, especially on that day. Likewise, we should not be forgetting God, because he should be truly important to all of us. Now, James doesn't stop there. Forgetting God isn't just wicked and terrible. If we look at verse 16, it says, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So James is saying that to forget God is also boastful, and it's arrogant. It's prideful. When you forget God, you take his place in your life. You're elevating yourself to the position where God should be in your life. You're playing his role. A well-known early Christian, St. Augustine, wrote this: God made us to be like him and reflect his goodness. But because of our sin, we now try to be like God in all the wrong ways. You see, God is the only being who is fully self-sufficient, depending on no one or nothing. We are not that. We depend on a lot. We depend on our spouse, we depend on our friends, we depend on our fellow Christians or congregation. At least we should be, but we should also definitely depend on God. When you forget God, when we forget God, we try to be like God, self-sufficient, dependent on nothing. But how often does that truly work out for us? How often do we get smacked in the face by our own pride because we thought we could do it this way and really, no, not happening. So why is this so bad? Again, why is this so bad? Well, partially because of worry, all right? I'm sure most of you know what worry is, but I'm going to define it how Timothy Keller does. He says, worry happens when we try to know everything, but we can't. So we can't obviously know everything. We're not God. But we try, and we try to act on the fact that we think we know everything, and because we don't, we get stressed and we worry. We all have worries. We've all worried. We may worry about how we're going to pay our next bills. We may worry about our next meal that may come. We may worry about the safety of family, kids. And we eventually worry to the point of us saying, I know. We say, I know I must get my money to pay the bills. I know what is good for my life. I know what has to happen in my life, and I know what would make my life better. We elevate ourselves up by saying we know the answer. This is an area where we perhaps unknowingly try to take God's role in our life and try to know everything. What soon follows is this. We may say, I know how to do this thing, but I am afraid that I won't do it and I'll fail. I'm afraid. And that's where worry really starts to creep in. And this is where forgetting God is just awful for us. It is better for us to say, I don't know the answer, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I am going to seek God. I'm going to seek his counsel, seek his word, seek his followers to see what they have to say to help me. Sure, we may still be anxious at times, but I bet that worry will definitely go down if you start putting God in that place. That is because you know that God is in control, and this is totally freeing. We can defeat worry by just trusting in God. Now, what about those times that we find ourselves bitter in life? What about us feeling like failures or imposters because others have gotten a particular place in their life, but we haven't? We all know people who are further along in life than we are and have things that we think we should have. You know why we get that way, though? Why we worry about it? It's all because, once again, we try to take on the role of God and think we should be all-powerful. Not only should we think we should be all-knowing, we think we should be all-powerful. We should be able to do whatever we want to do. And that's stressful in itself. It is a mistaken belief that those people who have made it further than you in life, that they did it on their own solely. It's only because God even allowed it. If we forget God in our life, we are doomed to go back and forth between feeling superior to people and feeling inferior to people. And it will give us kind of a whiplash. So how can we avoid this? Let's look back at the passage. James gives us the answer. In verse 15, he says, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. Did you catch what he didn't say? He didn't say, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. No, he says, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. We must stop whatever we are doing in life and recognize that the only reason we are even breathing right now is because God has allowed it to happen. And to realize that that is such a gift, the fact that we're even able to feel like we can do things. It's because God has allowed that to happen. Jonathan Edwards used to say this every morning when he woke up. He said, I must remember this, that everything I enjoy today that is better than hell is strictly by the mercy and upholding grace of a powerful God. His perspective is the fact that I'm not in hell right now or dead is a testament to who God is. It's beautiful that we're even alive today, that we woke up and we're able to even come here this morning. How different would our attitudes toward life be if we actually took on that same sentiment, if we started to believe this to be an actual truth? How different would our attitudes toward life be and towards the people that have gone further than us be. The person has gone so far in their career and I haven't. What does it matter? I'm living, I'm alive today because God allowed me to be. We must look at every part of our lives and recognize it is all because of God's grace. We must recognize that it is not us that holds ourselves up, it is God. And we must not forget him. This takes the pressure off. This makes us less prideful. This brings our contentment up. Paul always said he'd be content in all things, whether he was rich, poor, in prison, free, whatever. He was content. And that's something that I hope for all of us to be able to get to, content in all circumstances. And it goes to remembering God daily in all that we do. I challenge you and myself with this today. Let's seek him and remember him in every aspect of our lives. From planning for the future to what we may do this afternoon, we must not forget God. Now that was just a small part of this entire passage. That was just the end of chapter 4. Now we're transitioning to chapter 5, and quite frankly, James is only ramping up. This is one of the areas where he just gets super brutal. Quite frankly, it's hard for us to take what he's about to say next. As we continue in James, we see that forgetting God not only impacts our plans, but also impacts our attitudes towards wealth and how we treat others, even though we know we should be loving. So James 5, 1 through 6 says this: "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on this earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person, and he does not resist you." So let's quickly look through these verses, just kind of for a quick explanation. We'll kind of go through before we get a little more in depth with them. So verses 1 through 3, James here is addressing the rich. He starts with a very stern warning, and he's speaking directly to those who have accumulated wealth, tons and tons of wealth, but have done so without regard to God. They've forgotten God also, and they've done so without regard to others. It's hard not to think of so many people here in the United States especially, we're such a country of extreme wealth, and for some reason, so many of us Christians at some point, we say, this is my money. I've worked hard for this money, and I'm going to do with it whatever I want to do. Once again, we're forgetting God, and we're forgetting his children in that, and it's a very dangerous thing. I wonder how, if we're saying that kind of thing, are we actually remembering or even thinking about God in that terminology? James goes on to describe the fate of these early Christians' riches. It says they're rotting and corroding. And this imagery is very powerful, showing the temporary and ultimately futile nature of wealth when it's hoarded and misused. What's the point of getting to the end of your life and you have just piles and piles of wealth, and you didn't share it, you didn't help others when you know there's so many in this world that are in need, but you're dead, and the wealth is just there now. So moving on to the verse 4, we have to examine the injustice and exploitation that happens. James moves to a more specific accusation, which is essentially fraud. He says, "The wages that are withheld from laborers are crying out against the rich, and these cries have reached the ears of the Lord." This highlights God's deep concern for justice and the plight of the oppressed. There are so many people oppressed in this world. What comes to mind immediately would be like the sweatshops in China, right? All of our phones are probably made, or some component made in these sweatshops. Those people are oppressed, and they're not getting paid or even treated the way they should. And we often do that here in the U.S. as well. We try and maybe cut somebody's throat just to get a little ahead. It's kind of a American ideology to do what I have to in order to get as far in life as I possibly can. It doesn't matter what's left in my wake. This verse is a reminder that our actions and sometimes our inaction, especially those that harm others, are seen and judged by God. Then in verse 5 through 6, he talks about self-indulgence and its consequences. The rich are accused of living in luxury and self-indulgence, fattening their hearts for a slaughter, which to me, that's pretty brutal. That's brutal terminology, that you're fattening your heart for slaughter. We live in a culture, unfortunately, that applauds luxury and self-indulgence and encourages it. You can't turn the TV on or Netflix, anything that has ads, without seeing some form of, hey, buy this because it'll make your life better, and just make your life the best possible no matter what you do. Let me real quick note this, that these passages are not just directed towards ministers or missionaries or pastors. It definitely applies to them too, but this passage is directed from James to the congregation that heard this letter. That means we, church, as followers of Christ, we are not exempt from what James is saying here, which is pretty tough. It's hard. Now, also let me make it clear, James is not condemning wealth per se, not just wealth for wealth's sake. He's condemning wealth with the misuse of it, because with Christians with wealth should be the most impactful people in the world. But so often we're not. We're sometimes probably seen as the most hypocritical and selfish people in the world because of how we handle our wealth. Now that we have kind of a broad overview of the 6 verses in this passage, let's take a look at some of the common questions that come looking at this. One common question I came across is, who is James even talking to in these passages? There are a lot of people that would say, just based on how severe he is, he's not even talking to Christians. How could he be talking to Christians in this? However, through the context, through the rest of James, the fact that James was led in small little churches, we know that this was not at all directed to non-Christians, but to Christians, directly to Christians. So the next question then is, why is James being so severe in all this? He's using strong language because it is a severe situation. James hasn't held back punches throughout the rest of this book, so why would he do that now when it comes to wealth? I mean, you read the rest of the gospel, you read the rest of the New Testament, that's one of the things that's hammered home pretty often, is misuse of wealth. He's also severe because it's a situation where the church was being fruitless and materialism had taken over their entire life. And it shows the dangers of that. Paul tells us in Galatians what the fruits of the Spirit are, so that we can avoid the fruitlessness that James was talking about. Galatians 5:22-23 says this, "But the fruits of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law," he says. These are the things that we should be growing in as Christians. The closer we come to Christ, the more we pursue him. These are the very things that should be just growing more and more and more. And James was seeing a lack of growth in these rich Christians. And he saw the love of money there. And that's why he was using some destructive language, is because he's seeing their love of money is destroying their spiritual, it was giving them spiritual decay. Again, Timothy Keller points out that an extended period without growth in Christ-likeness should make us uncomfortable. James is not saying that these people are not Christians, but they have no right to comfort themselves in their current state. We are not able to determine who isn't a Christian, but we have been given discernment to be able to look at their lives. There are certain people that we can say, yeah, for sure, I know you know Christ. But then there are other people, the way they live, we're like, I can't judge it, but I'm definitely not certain that you know Christ, based on the way that you're living. And James is trying to hammer this home to these rich Christians in particular. Lack of growth, So what are some of the dangers of materialism? I mean, you almost think that it would be evident that it would be kind of self-explanatory, but we're all products of materialism, especially in the United States. So what are some of the dangers? James outlines several dangers of the love of money in this passage that we need to look at and take seriously. Hoarding wealth instead of using it for good. He says one of the other dangers is living in luxury and self-indulgence. So we have hoarding wealth, living in luxury, self-indulgence, and then also exploiting others for financial gain. Again, Timothy Keller emphasizes the need to distinguish between necessities and luxuries in our lives. He says we have to look at everything in our life and honestly ask, is this a necessity or a luxury? Do I really have to spend money on this, or could I be giving this money away to somebody who actually needs it more? This is absolutely tough, especially here in the U.S. But let me tell you, this is the level of sacrifice that we are called to. 1 Peter 4:8-10 tells us this. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gifts you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. We can't do that very well if we hoard our wealth and keep it just to ourselves. In order to apply what James is saying and avoid these dangers, avoid the dangers of condemning the rich, we must truly examine ourselves and be honest with ourselves. Another quick thing, you may be thinking to yourself, like I was, I'm not rich, I'm middle class. Or maybe I'm actually poor compared to some of the people I work with, or some of the people I know. I'm poor, I'm not rich. But a quick Google search will quickly reveal that even if you're one of the richest or poorest people here in the United States, your standard of living and the money that you have is way beyond so much of what the world has. And so we can't fool ourselves into thinking that this passage isn't for us, because it definitely is. So again, how do we avoid these pitfalls of materialism? We must examine our attitudes towards wealth. One of the hardest things for us to do is to be honest with ourselves. It's very easy for us to look at each other and judge what you're doing, say, oh, you're doing this wrong, you're doing that, you should be doing it a lot better, you should be doing it different. It's very hard for us to actually turn that sentiment back on ourselves. Self-reflection is definitely one of my weak points, and I imagine it is for a lot of people, just because it's so much easier to look at other people's flaws than our own. But to be brutally honest with ourselves is terribly difficult. However, to really live this life as Christians, we need to learn to be honest with ourselves so that we can also be honest with God whenever we're talking to Him, whenever we're praying, whenever we're seeking Him. In 2 Corinthians 13, Paul tells us, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Or do you not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you? We must examine ourselves. And if we believe Christ is in us, that should be an easy thing. Of course it's not, because we're sinful creatures, but we should be seeking God and examining our hearts to see what it truly says. When it comes to our wealth, we need to ask ourselves, is my standard of living going up as fast as my income is going up? We need to honestly ask ourselves, should it? Should our standard of living go up at the same rate as our income? This goes against our American dreams, our gut American dream ideals. But let me assure you, those American dreams most likely aren't actually coming from Scripture. The more we make, the greater the divide should be between where we actually live and where we are capable of living financially. Let me tell you a story about John Wesley. He was the founder of the Methodist Church. He started out as a simple preacher, but over the years, as the Methodist Church grew, he became rather wealthy through his publications, his speaking, whatever it was. It is well known that he made 30 pounds a year and gave away 3. Well, that seems pretty standard, 10% tithe, right? That's what we're always taught. But the next year he made 40 pounds and he gave away 10. So he's living on 30 pounds. The next year, he made 70 pounds and gave away 40. He's still living on 30 pounds. And at one point, he was making 1,400 pounds a year. Of course, this was way back in the day, so that doesn't sound like a lot now, but it was back then. So he was giving away 1,400 pounds, or almost 1,400. He stayed living on 30 pounds alone. He found a point where he felt like he should live, where he felt comfortable living and giving the rest away. That's pretty powerful. Some of you may know who John Piper is. He's a well-known evangelist today. And he does basically the exact same thing, almost to the T. Like he's capped himself at a certain level, and everything beyond that he gives to missions, he gives to the needy. It's absolutely incredible. Both of these Johns, they're excellent examples of someone who gave away money, gave away much of their income to live simply and to help and serve others. Another interesting example that I found was that of Rupert Guinness. He was from the famous Guinness brewing family. Little known fact, but the entire family was very devout from their early beginnings all the way up to the point that Guinness became what it is today. Obviously, they were rich beyond measure. Now, Rupert Guinness, when he married his wife, Lady Gwendolyn, shortly after their wedding, his dad gave them 5 million pounds. Now, in comparison to John Wesley, right, he was getting 1,400 a year at a peak, right? And this is around the same time era. They were getting 5 million pounds. So that just says how much more insane that is. I mean, 5 million then would be, I don't know, I should have done the math, but it's a lot more than 5 million now. So this is an account of what happened. Rupert might have passed his days as a wealthy young man, or as many of the wealthy young men of his time usually did. You know, being at sport, being at a club, whatever. But Rupert was made of better stuff. And this seems to have come as a surprise to nearly everyone who knew him. He'd absorbed the Guinness concern for the needy, that family's sense of obligation to use wealth for good and for the good of mankind and for Christ. When he received his wedding gift of 5 million pounds from his father, he did not set himself up in fashion or comfort or luxury. Instead, he moved him and his bride into a home in the slums and launched a crusade to ease the plight of the poor. He sold everything. He gave his money away, 5 million pounds, so that he could live and help the ones who actually needed. His social class was scandalized. The common man in Ireland was moved, and the media barely knew what to even make of it. It was so unheard of. Their actions exemplify the biblical principle found in James 5, 1-6, where James warns against the dangers of hoarding wealth and living in luxury while neglecting the needs of others. Instead of clinging to their riches, Rupert and his wife used their resources to uplift and serve the marginalized, leaving a lasting impact on both their community and the Guinness family legacy. We need to be mindful of not letting our love of money lead us to a life of luxury and self-indulgence. Again, this is very difficult for us who grew up in the U.S., as we are told from an early age that we should get as rich as possible, as quick as possible, and in whatever way possible we can. We could step on anybody that gets in our way. But there was someone else who stepped on someone for money. And if you don't know who it is already, I'll let you know shortly. So we've seen how we need to examine ourselves to avoid materialism and self-indulgence. And another way we can do this is to examine or to ensure that our actions are just and reflect the love and fairness of God. We need to make sure that whatever our actions are doing reflect the love and generosity of God. This means being generous, fair, compassionate in our dealings with others. I wonder if you guys remember this story from Mark, not very long ago, that we kind of wrapped this story up. When Jesus was anointed in Bethany, it says that this passage says this: "And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, 'Why was that ointment wasted like that?' For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always will have the poor with you, and whatever you want, you can do for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done, we will be told in memory of her." She basically said, all of my worldly security, I pour out on the Lord. I'm pretty sure Jason mentioned this, but that the nard that she broke and poured over Jesus very likely was either her life savings or her dowry. It's all that she had. It was her life, what she had accumulated. And she said, "Lord, this is yours. This is yours." In the same passage, like right after, it says, "Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him." Immediately after she broke the thing and poured it on Jesus, Judas got up and betrayed Jesus. Immediately. We're in this passage, we're shown two extreme responses to wealth. We see one from her, Mary, just very sacrificial and loving towards Jesus and trusting in Jesus. And then we see one that it seems like he was immediately disgusted and said, "No, forget that. I'm going to betray him for my 30 pieces of silver. I'm going to step on this guy, get my 30 pieces of silver." One sacrificial and one selfish. I don't know if you've noticed this as you read Scripture, but sacrificial living is pretty huge, and loving others is huge. Philippians 2 says this, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves." That's a sacrifice. How hard is it to count others more significant to ourselves? It's our natural tendency to defend ourselves, to put ourselves above everybody else. But we're told time and time again not to do that. We're supposed to love our brothers more than even ourselves. We see James even referencing Judas' betrayal of Jesus in a roundabout way in verse 6. He said, in verse 6 it says, "You have condemned and murdered the righteous one, and he does not resist you." Ultimately, James is saying, like, the righteous one in that passage is referencing Jesus. It's a direct reference to Judas betraying Jesus. And Jesus not resisting. He didn't resist the betrayal. He voluntarily died for us. The last thing that we can do to avoid the pitfalls of materialism and self-indulgence is to learn to live with eternity in mind in order to avoid the love of money. We should live with an eternal perspective, recognizing that Jesus is coming back. People who love money ultimately forget this fact. This is another way we tend to forget God. C.S. Lewis says this, "If you have a proper understanding of the second coming of Christ, you will have a proper understanding of this world." Our plans, wealth, our actions should reflect an awareness that we will one day stand before God. This should free us from the love of money and help us live generously and sacrificially. So, together, let's strive to remember God in every aspect of our lives, our plans, our wealth, and our interaction with others. If we remember him, he will not forget us, as Psalm 9 said. It reminds us that if we remember him, he will not forget us. By acknowledging his sovereignty, practicing justice and generosity, and living with eternity in mind, we can avoid the pitfalls of arrogance and self-sufficiency and live lives that honor God. The best way we can avoid all the issues presented today is by listening to what Jesus said in Matthew 22. And he said to them, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment." So there is that. We can't forget God. We are to strive and love him with our entire being. But Jesus also immediately after says this, "And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." So I think we all have this idea of what love is. And to some degree it's probably correct. But what does Scripture actually say love is? If you've been to a wedding, again, I keep using that. If you've been to a wedding, you've probably heard 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7. And it defines love as this. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. As I said in the beginning, there are two things that I wanted us to come away with today. One is to strive to love God and not forget Him in anything that we do. And the second one is let's love others and put them before ourselves. Can you imagine what our lives would look like if we remember God? And what the world would look like if we truly loved others more than ourselves? I can't help but wonder if the world will get better at that point. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for today. Thank you for everything you do for us, Lord. Thank you for your word. Thank you that you've placed it in our lives so that we can examine it, so that we can learn more about you and not forget you, Lord, but we can learn how to pursue you and love others, Lord. And I ask that you would help us all in this room today be able to grow in that aspect. In your name I pray. Amen.